So, good afternoon, thanks for coming out. And this is a talk on Mark Whalon, who was with a very interesting career over in East Dorset. He was born, raised, and died in East Dorset. And this is based on an article that was in the Lunchtime Review, most recent issue. Tyler Resch, who wrote The History of Dorset, is the editor of the Lunchtime. I like to think the soft spot for the history of Dorset. Mark Whalon, let me get to my scripts here. I'm pretty sure this is a magazine that has my article on it. So in 2015, the Dorset Historical Society received a copy of East Dorset poet Mark Whalon's collection of poems called Rural Peace, published in 1933. The Society's Dorset author shelves already had the book, but what set this copy apart was a small envelope placed inside the back cover. In 7 newspaper clippings, it contained 7 newspaper clippings of poems Whalon had published in local newspapers, but which had never been collected into a book. And here's that famous envelope, just stuck in there, the newspaper clippings folded over. 5 of the poems were dated 1934 to 1936, while 2 were undated. One of the undated poems, Just Livin' on a Margin, was a rare literary commentary about the eugenics movement then sweeping Vermont, as well as a New Deal resettlement program. And here's a poem. In case you can't all read that poem, don't worry. Jon Mark Whalon, 1886 to 1956, lived most of his life in East Dorset. He graduated from the Burton Seminary in Manchester and continued his studies at the University of Vermont. This is East Dorset in the 1890s, a kind of a bird's eye view of the town to give you an overview of it. This is where he lived at least later on Village Street, just south of the Wilson House. And this is at East Dorset School, where he would have attended elementary school in winter and summer. It was torn down in the early 1960s to make way for the town offices, which are still there now. And that's Burton Academy from the early 20th century. Seminary, yes, known as Burton Academy today. So after he graduated from there, he went to University of Vermont. During World War I, he served as an aerial photographer for the 1,102nd Aero Squadron. And these are not pictures of him, but just to give you an idea of the size of the cameras that they've lifted up and used at the time. They're fairly large, and I assume heavy pieces of equipment that they used to take pictures of battlefields and of the cities. Returned to East, held a few jobs for the next few years, but then from 1925 to 1950, he delivered mail through the Valley. Now, today, Whalon is remembered primarily first childhood friend of Bill Wilson, 1895 to 1971. He was significantly older than Bill, 9 years older, but I guess they had a big brother, little brother kind of relationship. Bill was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's a picture of Bill Wilson there, POW, and the Wilson House. Tavern at the time, and it's now been renovated to be a retreat for members of Alcoholics Anonymous. And sadly, the person who spearheaded a lot of the renovation there, Bonnie Burke, recently passed away, which shocked many of us. Second, he was the subject of a January 14th, 1943 Life magazine photo essay by the renowned photographer Albert Eisenstadt. During the war, a lot of national magazines were doing articles not only on the war, of course, but also of what life was like in small towns. There was one article in Harper's, for instance, about a car garage here in Dorset Village, written by Cowenhoven. And then there was this Albert Eisenstadt photo thing in Life magazine about the journeys and daily mailman. And the picture I showed of Mark Whalon with the postmistress, or town clerk actually, Sadie Sherlock, was one that Eisenstadt took. The third thing he's known for is the collection of poems of rural peace, 33, up of previously published poems that had been published in the Rutland Herald and the Manchester Journal. And fourth, his memoir, Rural Free Delivery, published in 1942. And Eisenstadt came to East Dorset partly to help promote that book, Rural Free Delivery. During Whalon's time, East Dorset was a village in the tight valley of Vermont, with marble quarries and mills on the west and lumber operations and mills to the east. Both lumber and marble were harvested up the steep mountains and brought down the hills to be processed. This is one of the hilltop quarries, stereo view from the 1880s. And this is a marble mill in East Dorset, and the railroad going right through town was still a lot more active than it is today. Those mill buildings are all gone now. And there were mills all up and down the valley that again are not there anymore. Small farms dotted the narrow fields up and down the valley. But by the 1920s, the quarries and marble mills had all closed, and lumbering operations were dwindling. Farmers continued on, and some people began living in the forests on the mountains on both sides of the valleys. Some in houses, some in handmade huts, and many squatters remained there until the 1990s. This is a world that gave Whalon the inspiration for his poem, Just Living on a Margin. A place not only in decline generally, but even more so because of the Great Depression. When Whalon began writing his poems, it's not or why. He didn't seem to have any literary interests before around 1928 when his first poem was published. Perhaps he was inspired by his friend, poet Walter Hard, who lived from 1880 to 1966, a few miles south in Manchester. Both attended Burton Seminary. By 1928, Whalon was publishing his poems regularly in the Rutland Herald under the banner of Howard L. Lee's Nations appeared daily in the Rutland Herald for many years, decades, and featured a stable of local. So this is a newspaper column in the Rutland Herald, page 2 or page 4. No. Page 2 or page 4, I think. Most of the right up front, featuring a different, writing about a different Vermont topic. And some of the poems that were included in skills or related to politics. They were usually followed by Hindley's pithy commentary. And the ones about politics were usually about town meeting day and how everyone gets together and talks about town business, and nothing more specific than as a testament to how popular poetry was at the time, the Herald also ran Edgar Guest's nationally syndicated Just Folks poetry column next to Peregrinations. Though the original publication still needs to be discovered, it was either in Peregrinations or the Manchester Journal, or Just Living on a Margin, first appeared in 1934. You have been able to narrow it down to 34. It was very, and there were, as we'll see, there were a lot of poets, nationally known poets in the area at the time. Before reading the poem, it seems wise to review briefly a history of eugenics. The term was first used in 1883 by Sir Dr. Galton to describe the ideas of changing biological characteristics in ways deemed beneficial to human society. The idea developed into two mythologies, negative and positive. The elimination of strains deemed inferior, mostly through sterilization, and trying to enhance, intellectually and physical, people deemed not inferior. So you got that two-pronged thing. One, okay, this person, these people are inferior, we sterilize them, get them out of the gene pool. These people are great, so let's make sure that we raise our kids so they're the smartest they can be, because they're genetically superior, as opposed to equal with everybody else, potentially equal with everybody else. Although the eugenics movement became popular in the United States after the publication of Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, Vermont's first sterilization law was passed earlier than that, in 1912. However, it was vetoed by the governor, John Meade, because he thought it was unconstitutional. It was also around this time that there were a slew of other laws being passed around the country. I believe the first one was in Connecticut. There was also one in Indiana, and then a few other states where the legislature passed it, but it didn't pass the governor's veto. So that pretty much put a kibosh for about 10 years on the eugenics movement in Vermont. It came back in the late 20s and early 1930s, mainly under something called the Vermont Commission on Country Life, which is such a nice sounding thing. It's a commission. It's on country life. Young researchers were sent around to interview people who may have been from quote-unquote defective families in order to prove genetic relationship, criminal activity, low performance in school, and poverty. Then, the year the United States Supreme Court in Buck 1941 ruled sterilization laws constitutional, Vermont finally passed its sterilization law. Despite the questionable motives of the researchers, the records now held in the Vermont State Archives are remarkable interviews, or included are remarkable interviews with people around the state, including women at the Rutland Women's Prison, which are especially harrowing. If you ever have some spare time and you're up in Middlesex and you go into the archives, ask to read them. They are just horrible, horrible lives that these women had before they were sent to jail. In jail for alcohol abuse or committing violence against their abusive partners. Everything known about the interviewees comes through the darkly colored glasses of the eugenicists. So even though these prison interviews exist, and we know what some people were like who were deemed effective. We don't know what they thought of it, because it's all through the glasses of the eugenicists. There remain scant records of what people in remote communities thought about the young college-educated interviewers coming to their families. Mark Whalon's Just Living on a Margin is especially interesting because it can be seen as a rare example of what they might have thought. The disenfranchised are disenfranchised. They don't have a voice. We find the voice in a historical context. That's always interesting to see. Now, also in 1931, the Vermont Commission on Country Life published the research report, Rural Vermont, a program for the future. Submitted by, quote, 200 Vermonters. That was the name of the author. 200 Vermonters. Remember that name. In his foreword to Mark Whalon's book, published just 2 years later, Peregrination's curator, Hindley, seems to reference that text. He wrote in the foreword, "In the name of 200 old friends and colleagues who from time to time have appeared in Mark's company, I welcome Rural Peace as an opus of Vermont and a permanent contribution to our steadily richening store of literature." This could be a wink and a nod from Rural Peace to Rural Vermont, which would explain the odd statement about the 200 old friends, and also about native literature. The eugenicists, one of the things they were concerned about was the decline of the good old Yankee stock. Things that people just aren't as good as they used to be. And it's all because of inferior gene pool that's infected Vermont. And so we've got to get back to the old ways and recreate our native literature. And in rural Vermont, there was a section on just that topic. It's a very comprehensive book. It's a really incredible read. You can still find it online. To promote native literature in rural Vermont, this is the final page of the report on literature, traditions and ideals, and it ends up, the old stock is here still, in greater proportion to the total population than in any other commonwealth of the North. The old spirit is by no means dead. All we need is organization, the power and habit of working together and determined purpose. And all we need for organization is leadership. Leaders who will see the goal plain and who will create themselves to attaining its high patriotic devotion. So they're basically saying, look, we've got to get real Vermont literature around here because everything else is horrible. And who are the signers of this? There are three who I want to point out. One was Sarah Clegg. Then you'll see down Zephine Humphrey Fonstock, and then Dorothy Canfield Fisher. These were three women who were nationally known writers who lived right in this area. Horn lived in Manchester. Dorothy Canfield Fisher lived down in Arlington. And Zephine Humphrey lived over in the corner of West Road and Church Street here. Later she lived in the Hollow. Here they are. And so these were people who were contemporaries of Mark Whalon's, who lived here, but were very much in favor of the eugenics movement. Perhaps a positive side, education over, not really talking about sterilization. And as you can see, they were 6 years apart in age. And like I said, they were nationally renowned writers. I love this one. I think it's the Aquatic Country Club and the Orvis Factory on Union Street in Manchester that she's talking about here. It's a famous poem she wrote called The Golf Links. The golf links lie so near the mill that almost every day the laboring children come and see the men at play. And she was also very much involved with left-wing politics. She was in the Socialist Party, Dorothy Canfield Fisher wrote anti-racist editorials in the Rutland Herald. She also was one of the first promoters of the Montessori method of education in the United States with her novel A Montessori Mother. And then Zephine Humphrey wrote mainly stories about Dorset and living in a small town in Dorset. In her book Winter Wise, it's her descriptions of hurrying up and getting everything done right before Christmas. I have to go back and read that every year because it talks about how crazy Christmas is. And she later on wrote books about going to the Sierras and whatnot, and also a book about Vermont in general. So the leader of that, the first name on that list, and some other people, put together a series of 4 books. And here they are. Vermont Folk Songs and Ballads by Helen Harkness Flanders, who was also listed on the list there. Vermont Verse and Anthology. And Vermont, a Book of Biographies. Back is Vermont Prose. And these were published in 1931, along with the Rural Vermont book. And they're really, really verse by 115 Vermont. The opening line in the introduction reads, quote, "The editors of this book have attempted to discharge credibly a task assigned them by the Committee of Vermont Traditions and Ideals, acting under and in behalf of the Vermont Commission on Country Life. The book remains an interesting review of Vermont poets who have published if people don't need the work, why give up the work of people who are working? You know, why do make work when it's not needed? And I have it here, but it's a rather long poem, and I won't bore you with it right now, but if you want to read it, we do have it here. Now, so here's the New Deal coming up. After the eugenics movement and during the eugenics movement, and kind of a double whammy, is a proposal to relocate rural citizens deemed to be living on submarginal land. So first of all, if you're poor, they're coming after you for being deficient. And if you live on really out their land, your land is deficient. You just can't do anything right. So the land would be purchased by the federal government and turned over to the public domain uses, such as logging. Representatives from Washington, D.C. touted the idea before the Vermont legislature in early 1934 and went into the field to identify lands that might qualify for the program. The issue was hotly debated throughout 1935 when the legislature placed so many restrictions on any land sales to the federal government that they closed their Resettlement Administration Office, which was in Rutland State. So they came, tried to promote this idea. The legislature stonewalled them, basically, enough so that they closed down. But when they were here, they were in Rutland, which meant, that's where they were radiating out from. So the effects would be felt, say, in Danby and in Dorset, this whole area. So the state government had been determining whether people were mentally fit to raise children and generally live in remote areas. The federal government was looking for the submarginal lands where people should not be allowed to live. Both of these concerns collide in Just Live, probably written in 34, 35. Okay. So you want to hear the poem? This is where you say yes. Just margin. And it's written in dialect, and I'm going to try not to have a dialect accent, but if I slip it, my apologies. And so I'm living on margin land. Oh, don't that beat the devil? I know 'twere rocks and cradle knolls, and scarce a rod of it level. But I never knowed its rightful name till just the other day, till some bright young feller came up here a-making a land survey. They called me a poor benighted cuss, and seemed right full of pity, and said as I had no chance up here, they'd move me to the city. They said I couldn't no how survive, as the land weren't fit for tillage. I'd be better off in a mining town or a manufacturing village. 'Tain't much of a farm, I know it ain't, and I never allowed as how there weren't some better farms for crops and better land to plow. I've been discouraged lots of times and felt that hired hand who used to plow that field there and curse and damn the land. He allowed that when the Lord was through and had the world all done, he dumped the whole of it sleeve in here and turned his back and run. He said 'twa'n't part of the world at all, and that the Lord, he never meant anything, just throwed it in to hold the rest together. But pshaw, I ain't as bad as that, and life's been worth the living, for it ain't the things that's handed you, and it ain't the things you're given. It's the things you has to struggle for, and the things you does without, that makes you, way down deep I mean, what the preachers preach about. And Ma and me, we get along and had a little to spare to send the children off to school or go to the county fair. Of course we had to scrimp and save and watch ourselves and figure, but the funny thing about scrimping is it kind of makes you bigger. No, Bob, our oldest, left the farm. He's in the city. He's a lawyer now and it smarts a trap, from what I hear folks telling. I got to write the news to Bob, which will cause him great humility, to learn his dad has got so bad, he's become a state liability. And Ma, she'll write to Betty too. Betty hankered after knowledge, teaching now just outside New York in a female finishing college. I don't know what they learned, but it's just for weren't up to snuff like hers. The Lord, he hides a book of fate from all us earthly critters, for if we know it was to come, we'd always have the jitters. He's nicer still to some of us. He mars us in the making, so we see how dumb we be, or the chances we're taking. For instance now, take Ma and me. Great Scott, and land of Goshen. of the awful state that we was in. We never had no notion. And now we're a social problem, and nothing I know is worse than because Ma's a degenerate inbred, and I'm an underprivileged cuss. And that's that poem. Then, just to sum up, Mark Whalon died in 1956. That's his tombstone and his headstone over in St. Jerome's Cemetery. Any questions?
What cemetery was that?
St. Jerome's in East Dorset, off of Mattom Road. There's a church, Lyra Lane.
Oh, yeah.
They used to go to the church. The cemetery is still there.
Okay.
All right. There are great things that Marilyn brought. This month, it'll be, the presentation will be by Terry Tyler and Judy Harwood about ice harvesting. So come on by for that third Thursday of February. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John.